Welcome to the Styleframe Saturdays podcast. I'm your host, Caroline Lee. Join me as I take a deep dive into the wonderful world of Styleframes and interview those who are industry wizards when it comes to this stage of the animated production process. For those who may not know, Styleframes are pieces of creative that are developed during the pre-production phase of an animation project, and they help creators and clients alike get an idea of the overall style of a piece. Sometimes the initial vision is carried through to the end, and other times it ends up on the cutting room floor. During this podcast, we'll discuss projects of all shapes and sizes, and the challenges, rewards, and lessons learned while developing what I like to call each guest's favorite frame. Before getting into the details of today's show, the Styleframe Saturdays team would like to give a quick shout out to Riverside FM. Riverside is the tool that we use to develop this podcast, and it simply wouldn't exist without it. Its effortless ease of use and amazing support team are part of the reasons why we're such huge fans, and we've got a link in the description for anyone who's interested in checking it out. So now that you know how we're getting this podcast to you, let's dive into episode 3. Today's guest is the definition of a one-man band. The guy can simply do it all. From video to animation to design and even sound design, his talents run the gamut of all things creative. He's worked with studios like Elastic, Swarovski, and Ordinary Folk, just to name a few, and has worked on projects of all different types. From the minute I discovered his work, I knew that I'd love to talk shop with him someday, so I'm pumped that that day is today. Please give a warm welcome to today's guest, Jordan Bergren. Hey, Jordan, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. How have you been?
I'm doing well, Caroline. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking.
Thank you so much for having me on. Super excited to be part of your blooming podcast here.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yes. No, it's very small at the moment. But, you know, it's a little space dedicated to Styleframe enthusiasts like yourself. So we're stoked that you're willing to join us today and talk a little bit about what you've been doing, what you've been up to. We'll get into like the main event with your favorite frame and everything. But yeah, I don't know. Why don't we just jump right into it? So
sure.
For anyone who doesn't know you, would you mind telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So I'm sure it's somewhere, but Jordan Bergren, and I've been kind of in motion design now for coming up on about 6 years. But actually, before finding motion properly, I was into the live action world. So when I grew up, my dad was a video producer. He still is, and I always grew up with a camera around the house. So that was kind of an easy lean into the business, I suppose, just because back in I graduated high school in 2006. So back then it wasn't like it is nowadays where kids just have cameras all the time, right? It was
Sure.
like we had a camera at home, like a nice professional one. And I remember still like way back when editing back on Media 100 before Final Cut really made a splash in that world. Yeah, way back when. And I wish, just as a side note, I really wish I could find these old ones because I never wanted to get into animation, like at all.
Really?
It seemed way too monotonous, just didn't dig it. And I knew that because when I was maybe about 10, I made these little stop motion pieces using Media 100. And I got so frustrated that I was like, screw it, let's just, we'll take the camera. There's no need to go through all this. But I still wish that I had those old things, those old recordings.
For sure.
Lost to history. But anyways, so I grew up with a camera around the house. Family was in video, so it was kind of a natural progression. And I went to college to try to figure things out on what I wanted to do with my life. I really didn't take video seriously as a profession. And it got to a certain point where I was like, gaining some professional steam, I suppose, so to speak. And I just decided, you know what, I'm going to drop out of college. I really enjoy doing this. So I focused on that. And all throughout my 20s, I was kind of a vagabond wandering around and doing a lot of freelance work for video world. And it wasn't maybe until like 2011, maybe 2012, that I even got After Effects. And at that time, it was just a supporting thing, like, oh, you can do cool stuff in here. But I never thought of motion graphics as something that I'd want to do. And, I was a musician. There's maybe about 4 years in my 20s where being a musician was my primary source of income. So I kind of had these side gigs of freelance work, and I didn't take it seriously. But then I met a girl, and it kind of made me realize, like, okay, what are my goals here? What am I working toward? And unfortunately, becoming a professional musician to pay the bills and like sustain my family didn't seem like a realistic option. So I kind of fell back in love with video, and that's when I discovered School of Motion and their first public animation boot camp. So this was like way back when Joey had just been doing the 30 days of After Effects, and I found this thing, and again, it was through the lens of live action video. So I didn't still know what motion design was, even though I still had like a pirated version of Cinema 4D. Maxon, don't come after me.
Disclaimer.
Yeah, disclaimer. Please don't. I'm not rich. Don't do it. But like I still loved doing this stuff, integrating it in within live action film. So I was more in like compositing and stuff. And then once I discovered that, it was like, oh, this is really, really cool. Because especially when you travel a lot, going out on shoots, we travel all over the nation, and it just kind of became monotonous. And I decided, like, I think I can have better success if I just focused on motion. I live in Iowa, which really, I've met a couple friends now who are super talented around here, but really we're on an absolute island by ourselves out here in MoGraph terms.
Wow.
So it seemed like a logical step to be like, I'm going to focus full time on freelance animation and design, and that'll give me better opportunities to stay here, stay with my wife. My wife's got a daughter, so I've got a stepdaughter. There really wasn't the option of going to a larger market, so it just seemed like a natural fit.
Okay, cool.
So from there, I really got into animation, which then, of course, my design was lacking. Like, all the inspiration that you'd start to find when you enter this world is just like this amazing, amazing work that you're seeing from people. And it was like, why doesn't mine look that way? I feel comfortable animating and making things feel good, but there's this huge missing piece, which of course is where the design comes in. So I really didn't have a lot of experience with design, never really graphic design at all, until I got into School of Motion's design boot camp. And Michael Frederick was amazing and really kind of opened my eyes to the world of design and how much I love doing that. It's part and parcel with the animation.
Sure.
So
well, you could have fooled everyone that that was your first time designing, because seriously, your designs are incredible.
I appreciate that. Well, I won't say it's my first time designing. It's my first time knowing what I'm doing designing, right? So I had plenty of years where I'm just throwing stuff up and thinking,
sure. So
text in the screen. Yeah. There you go.
Yeah. Like design, just kind of place it in there. Well, right. I'm sure you're, with a background in video too, though, you have like just a natural eye for composition. Yeah. So, and I'm sure that really helps when you're starting out doing design work as well. I feel like I've spoken to other motion designers who started out even just doing photography, and they're sort of like, the first time I jumped into design, I really had no idea what I was doing. I'm like, again, could have fooled me because it looks phenomenal. So.
Right. I think that you're 100% right, though. That makes a huge difference. Like my dad is kind of from the school of hard knocks. He learned his way through in the late 80s, right? Like way back when, shooting video and doing commercial work. And he really had an inherent eye for composition itself, but he never had the terms to really put to it.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, he was a true videographer from a kind of content perspective. He's all about story.
Sure.
So the things that he would feel and that he taught me were naturally kind of very grounded in quality composition. But that was passed on to me, where it's like, if you don't have really a term and a way to ground that
right
in your brain, it just is like, it's, just what you do, like the right third.
Yeah.
You don't even really think about it that way. It's just like, it feels good right here.
Right, exactly. Well, and that too, like even just the fact that it's kind of, in your blood to kind of like, do this sort of video and design and compositional stuff. I'm sure that helps as well too. You've just kind of been exposed to it for the longest time. And so, that's just my, opinion on it. I could be wrong,
right.
But it's really cool that you have you've had exposure to that ever since you were young and kind of grew up with it. So, I think that's really cool.
Thank you so much.
And you've
Yeah, I
been
really
freelance
appreciate
the
that.
whole time, right? It sounded like from what you were saying earlier, you were freelance video, freelance, well,
Yeah.
full time, doing musical gigs and everything, but you were
Mhm.
never really staff at a company, it sounds like.
I was.
Oh, okay.
So that was the thing is like I had those wandering periods where I really didn't know what I want to do with my life. Video was there. It
Gotcha.
gained traction. Like I could make enough to make a living, which at that point I was living for the weekend. You know what I mean? I'm a pretty social person. So I didn't really have like long-term goals. It wasn't until again I met my wife and it became more like, yo, I want to spend my time building something for the future that it then became, okay, music, you're going to take a back seat. And then I actually joined on with at the studio where my dad was at. And I worked there for a little while and we did a bunch of really fun stuff because it was a super small studio, but we had national clients. So it was like one of those amazing professional experiences too. Just, I love my dad to death. He's one of the sweetest guys. And he's extremely knowledgeable in the video world, but I started like getting this itch, so I like would find ways to integrate in motion once I discovered that into our work at the studio. So there was probably about a 4 or 5 year period, maybe 4 years, that I was kind of at that studio more in a full-time position before, basically saying, okay, my 30th birthday, that's the point. 6 months before that, start like ramping up a little bit of work, doing outreach to studios and getting some runway
Right, right.
put together,
Very
you know,
cool.
which the freelance in my 20s, like that's a very loose term. You know what I mean? It's so funny. Like once I found Joey's freelance manifesto,
Oh, the
which for those of
Bible.
you that don't know it, the Bible, it's amazing. Like I tell everybody about it, even if you're not in motion specifically, like
Yep.
any creative discipline, that is the go-to. And I think there's so many people out there that can tell you like this worked. I am proof that this works.
Right.
Follow this. It's really simple. You don't have to be a
That's
genius,
right.
right? Like Joe has figured that out. But it's amazing. Once I read that, I was like, literally, I did the opposite of everything in this book in my 20s, you know? So, like, I had a ton of experience on how not to do things.
Right.
So, I do think that that helped a little bit in expediting my journey so far in the freelance world.
I feel like everyone's figuring stuff out in their 20s though too. So it's like, when it's funny when people have these sort of more meta conversations of like, we talk to kids about when they're seniors in high school, going out to college,
Mm-hmm.
like, what is it that you want to do for the rest of your life? Even that early too, you're sort of like, how would you know? Like you're
Right.
so young. But then
Yes.
even in your 20s
Yes.
too, it's sort of like you need to figure out what you're going to do so that you can like put food on the table and pay bills. Totally understand that. But at the
100%.
same time, it's sort of like, it's a time to figure stuff out, like,
Oh, absolutely.
just take in everything, see what works, see what doesn't, like you were saying,
Right.
because
And I love that you have that viewpoint because I really wish that, honestly, I wish that was more accepted within our culture.
yeah,
Like I know that over in Europe, like there's that time after high school, it's kind of like they encourage travel time,
right,
at least from some friends that I've talked to from the UK, like that's a thing. And in the US, it doesn't seem to be that. It's very much like, know what you want to do, go spend $40,000-$50,000 a year on tuition to like do what you want to do. It's like, whoa, hold up.
yeah,
I have no clue what I want to do, and I feel like it puts a lot of pressure. Like my nieces and nephews are just now getting to the age where my oldest niece, is now going into college, and she's like this anomaly to me because she has known since she was like 13 that she wants to be a doctor.
oh wow,
And she is driven, just working her ass off. She's smart. And I'm just like, I don't know how you did that because the rest of us are just like, I think that'd be fun, but
right,
you got to explore.
exactly,
You got to try it, to your point.
exactly. And I think too, any experience, it doesn't matter if it's like, tailored to the industry that you're trying to work towards or not.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like any experience just dealing with people, period, it's just good because
Absolutely.
you're going to interact with a ton of people over your
Yeah.
lifetime. Like forget professional career,
Yeah.
like your lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
So just being exposed to all different kinds of things, I always just feel like yeah, it
Absolutely.
applies. Ultimately, eventually, it's going to help you out.
Yeah. Absolutely. I could not agree more. I've got, a lot of things to say on
I was
this,
going
but
to
we
say,
don't
yeah,
have to take up the design podcast. Yeah.
we could have a whole separate
That's
conversation about
I
that. And I
know.
know a lot of
I
people
know.
sometimes, have threads about that
Yeah.
on Twitter. But yeah, no,
Mm-hmm.
those are always interesting conversations that I'm always sort of like,
Yeah.
taking a look at. I'm like, oh, what is everyone saying about this?
100%. 100%. Yeah.
Well, we just talked about, it's a design podcast. So let's jump into the design stuff. I'd love to jump into your favorite frame that you're going to share with us today. Could you tell us a little bit about the piece that you've selected?
Well, one, you put up a tall task. There's so many, that just as a side note, like the reason why I was struggling on this so much, which I think I sent you over like 3 options when I was drafting up that email, I had like 6 options because I couldn't make up my mind. Because it kind of like, I'm sure you've experienced this too, where there's cycles to it, right? At least like I'm really attracted to one thing. I used to be super attracted to like the chromosphere, cinematic illustration stuff. And that's really where I like got into motion at, and then that took a little bit of a turn once I realized, well, I really want to be working in title sequences. I want to be working in TV and film and not just paying the bills for, just random, normal corporate client work. And I realized, well, there's not a whole lot of chromosphere type work being done in that realm. So I really was like, I need to start focusing back on 3D and getting to know the render engines and, all that stuff that comes with that, the world we live in of having to learn a million different pieces of software. Sure. But it's hard because each one kind of was a good representation of the time and the cycle that you're in within your career. So it's like, this one isn't necessarily my favorite frame from a design perspective. I've got several of those, but it means a lot to me and it meant a lot to my career. So I figured I'd kind of approach it from that perspective and we'd have a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
So this frame that I'm going to share, again, I don't even know if it's my favorite frame within the piece, but it was an amazing experience. And I'm a huge proponent. We talked about that time of doing everything wrong in freelance in my 20s. Well, one of the biggest things that I did wrong was thinking that a client would just hire me because they could magically see that I'm talented without actually doing work and presenting that in a portfolio. So this piece kind of embodies that entire pivot in mindset for me, which of course came out of the Freelance Manifesto, right? But I did a personal project called Unabridged. And actually, Liam, your last guest, helped me out with some of the shots on there. So that was super cool to see that you had Liam on. I love that guy.
Yeah, he's great.
But it was a personal project that I had been working on over the course of almost, I think, like 10 months. God, it's been so long now, I don't remember. But, like with personal projects, you kind of chip into it here, chip into it here. Something distracts you. Professional work, chip into it here. And so this frame had at least some elements of the original design, which we'll get into, or the original approach. And quite frankly, my entire scheme that I had for this thing fell flat. Okay. And it didn't work. So that's kind of like the impetus on saying, maybe we should talk about this one because, once you fail, you got to pivot and try something for sure. Else. So this frame is from that entire project. And this project for me, just in context, was kind of the tipping point for me to get into some of these studios that I've so long looked up to and quite frankly never thought I'd have an opportunity to work with. So it really kind of means a lot to me, not only on a personal level, but on a professional level as well.
What's cool is that you kind of like, created this small team of people too, excuse me, for this like just passion piece of yours. And, for anyone who hasn't visited Jordan's, portfolio and particularly sort of like read the case study on this, go do it because you go into so much depth and detail about like the process behind this and, what it took to get here and who was involved and like just the concept behind it. I mean, it was just really like a breath of fresh air to sort of like just see your perspective on the whole thing and how you approached it. I feel like a lot of motion designers out there are always sort of like, that's a cool piece. I wonder what went into it. Part of the reason why I wanted to start this podcast too. I love the concept development side of stuff. So, hearing from you guys, what that entailed is just a really cool behind the scenes sneak peek, I think.
That's super cool to hear. Thank you. That makes me feel good.
All right, podcast is over. Done. Episode's over.
Yeah, done. That felt great.
But yeah, I had a couple of questions for you on this frame because you shared some of that behind the scenes material as well. The concept is so refreshingly original. I love that you partnered up with your friend DJ, who, I think is even in this frame. Let me just take a look at it
Yeah.
again, as the director of photography on it.
Mhm.
Would you mind explaining a little bit, where this concept came from?
Yeah, 100%. So as you said, like a big thing for me is case studies. So if you're interested in checking out the full piece that go hop over to my website and I'll do a lot better job of explaining it over there. But the whole concept kind of came out of, again, the goal, like this was to feed a goal. And not only was it to kind of scratch an itch, a creative growth itch, but it was also to try to accomplish this goal of, if you're trying to get into something like TV and film, especially, right? We all know, now I know, that you need to have pieces in your portfolio that show that you can do that work. Um, so really, I had this massive gap in my portfolio where I had done basically to that point maybe two kind of spec title sequences. One of them was this film supply and music bed national competition, where basically they give you like 40 different clips to download from film supply and a couple pieces of music to download from music bed, and then you can create this title sequence and then submit it in. So at the end of the day, I didn't have much on my portfolio to show, hey, I can be in this world, like I've got experience in it. So of course, let's do another personal project. And that was what led into, well, if it's going to be a personal project, what am I going to base it on? I don't really want to, which I've seen a ton of great artists out there do this, where they take an actual show and rework the title sequence
Right.
just as a spec piece. But I didn't really want to do that. I wanted to do something original that didn't have any reference point, because quite frankly, I'm not going to do it as well as the original creators did it. So I don't want to be
That's a good
compared
point.
to these people, right? Especially for the shows that I love. They also like usually have just a badass, beautiful, and like engaging title
Yep.
sequence. So what I did was I talked with my good friend Ryan Foisey, who at the time was a director, a theater director down in St. Louis. And they had this competition where playwrights from all over the nation would submit in short plays. And he had this one that he had sent me like a year before that I really loved. And it was called Unabridged. And the whole concept of it was basically that words are drugs, right? It's like the words have been outlawed and people are like aching for these things, so they have to go through these seedy networks in order to just get their fix on this one word, and they pay this person to be able to basically peddle out grammar and literature,
Very
essentially,
cool.
right? So that thought in itself was like, hey, that's a cool concept. What if we made that the show, and we use this script as a rough outline of what the show will be? Then I can kind of take that, we fleshed out ideas on what would happen in this fictional show that you never see on this final piece, but it helped be able to inform different ideas and trajectories and really like story arc for this initial piece. So from a conceptual standpoint, we had something to latch onto that we ended up fleshing out enough to have enough content to build
Mhm.
upon. Then from there, it was like, okay, conceptually, like, what are we going to do with this? And this is where DJ originally came in. Was we worked together. He's a super talented photographer. Like, he's really not in video at all. I think he's does some design work, but it was super fun because he's coming to this whole process, like to work with him and ideate on these things. He's not coming with the same lens. He's not looking at it through the
I
same
love that.
lens as we
Right.
are, right? So as him as a photographer, he's coming up with all these killer ideas that, quite frankly, us, you might just be like, well, that's going to be really hard to do technically. How are we going
Right.
to do
Right.
that? It's like he didn't care about that. He's just like, here's this idea. It's like, okay, we can't do that, but what if we kind of like take that core of an idea and spin it into something that could
Sure.
work? Because again, for me, a personal project should do a couple things. Like, it should, one, be able to progress your career and your abilities further, which I guess this kind of plays into the same thing. But also, like, you should be learning something new and trying out, whether it's a new technique or learning a new piece of software or approach, whatever it might be.
100%.
Um, yeah, it's to expand your
Yep.
bounds, right? Otherwise, you're just kind of regurgitating what you've done
Yep.
before, and you don't get the full potential out of it. So when we brought him in, I had this whole grand plan put together of doing projection mapping stuff And actually, inside of those notes that I sent you, like those behind the scenes stuff, you can see some of the little sketches that we did. It doesn't refer directly to our hero frame
Mm-hmm.
here, but we literally went out and we basically um, staged everything, like did a full blown video shoot with the full intent of rebuilding everything inside of
Wow.
3D and then projection mapping on. I had experience doing this, so this wasn't the new part for me to explore, but it seemed like a good basis to jump off from. And because I've done this before, I can't believe I had this massive oversight, right? We worked for a couple months putting all this together, getting photo shoots, getting locations together, getting actors, right? You can see inside there as well, I've got a kind of mood board for the actors'
Yep.
costumes that we'd be getting into. So from that, we do this entire thing. And of course, the thing that I completely spaced on was the bokeh that you get on the camera does not translate to projection mapping, because you're going to want to do that depth of field actually in the 3D space. So you still need crisp and clean. So we got through all this, and a massive oversight on my side once it came down to finally producing this was like, none of this works.
Oh my gosh.
It doesn't work at all. Right. And I'm sure DJ hated me for it. Like, he's the sweetest dude, so it's okay. But I think we're good.
Oh
I hope. But, it was like, okay, so that was pivot number one. Well, that's not going to work. What are we going to do then? So it's like, okay, we can still take these same concepts. I just need to rebuild them in a different way. At the time, I had really limited experience with Redshift. Redshift render engine. I get in there and I start learning things, and it worked out well as a good kind of way for me to slide in without being on a client's dime, So it was just, let's pivot and do that. So it was a whole lot of just switching up and reworking some of the images that we took. We were able to use a couple photos here and there. They were mostly of the characters and actors and friends that were, able to be a part of this thing. But that was the first kind of mess up, I guess.
Well, it looks like, it still looks like you used some of that projection mapping. Did you use a lot of like practical effects in addition to that projection mapping? Because some of this behind the scenes stuff looks like, you were filming like smoke, and there's even some technical stuff in here about like book dust. I would love to like hear about that a little bit more too.
So the original plan was to use a bunch of practicals, right? And just do a bunch of this stuff in compositing and post, like after it gets out of, usually I'll keep something. At least on this project, the plan was like keep it pretty bare bones, export out a beauty pass, maybe a couple depth mats and some AOVs for compositing, and then we do work from there. But again, because that whole thing broke with the original idea, there was less of that going on. So of course, with me learning Redshift, there was more opportunities available there as well, that I just decided to lean into that a little bit more and do more heavy lifting on the 3D side. And that kind of brought to that next pivot point of when I got done with this new approach of reworking everything, which, also I dove into photogrammetry, right? Like taking an actual object, which I'm sure the technology's come a long way now since then. But, take a bunch of pictures of it, stitch it together. You've now got a mesh to be able to use. And then, you do a bunch of refining passes through like 3D Coat and Substance Designer. And then you bring it back in and you drop it in Redshift. That was a cool process. Nothing really new, but it was new for me. And once that came out, we had this entire piece done, and it just felt like something I would have wanted to shoot with a crew, right? Like from a video perspective. But from a design perspective, I wasn't happy, because really it was my first time working in Redshift. It was good, like a hell lot better than you do in standard renderer, right? But still, I wasn't that great. So it's not like you could just get away on the beauty of this render. It's not like it was a Westworld piece, Westworld title sequence. So I needed to do something to try to add back in this element of design, which had completely been lost. Because the thing that I had fallen in love about, or with Redshift about, was it was literally like everything that I always wanted in the live action world was at my fingertips inside of Cinema 4D. Like I didn't need a crew. I could actually put a light, like on our hero shot here, there's this little light that you can't see, right? That's stuff that you can't do in real life. So to me, it was more of like my brain wasn't being exercised on the design front. It was being exercised on a compositional filmic front. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And
Yeah.
when your renders aren't super sexy, hyper realistic in that sense, it falls a little flat. So that was where it came back. I
Hmm.
was like, what can I do to this? I just ended up treating it like I would footage. The base renders as footage, and reworking that a little bit to include kind of the panels and this whole concept, which quite frankly, you know, there was so many little nuggets and Easter eggs in this thing, and so much thought had been put into the broader story, which of course nobody knows this story, right? So it doesn't really mean anything to anybody else. But there was all this context and these elements to ground it in. And at the end of the day, I ended up just doing the panels because I thought it looked good. There's no other purpose, you know.
Well, it did look good,
It's
and it added even more
right.
depth to it, in my personal opinion too. Because I feel like that's maybe a trademark to your style a little bit, is that you do a little bit of this like depth paneling from
Hmm.
time to time, and it adds just so much more to the composition.
Yeah.
So that's actually really cool to hear that, like, at first you're sort of like, oh, I've got, like, we've got bokeh, we've got everything at our fingertips, this is great. And then all of a sudden you're sort of like, oh my gosh, this feels
Yeah.
so flat. And then you kind of like go back into the
Right.
design side of stuff and then add even more
Yeah.
depth. That's such a really cool, just figuring it out on the job kind of experience.
And again, that's something you can't do in professional work. 90%,
Exactly.
98% of the time, it's not going to work that way. You need to bust out style frames, which I still love. Just like when I get a job, I'm just hired to design, get style frames out. I still really love that. But there was something pretty nice about this, which I'm sure you could feel yourself, right? Like those moments where you just have room to just explore and try stuff. And like, you know what, screw it.
Right.
It doesn't really have meaning. That's all right. Let's just make it look good. Like
Let's just
it's
play with
been,
it.
yeah.
It's interesting. That's a word that, like, I would love to incorporate more into this
Hmm.
year as well, is like, just like
Right.
play. You always have these constraints. And, we can talk about that a
Mhm.
little bit too, given that this was a personal piece, but, there's always obviously constraints with, commissioned or commercial projects. And, sometimes there's just not enough room to play. But like, my God, if there
I
was,
know.
you kind of wonder how some of these pieces would actually turn out
I
too.
know it.
Not that, what the end results aren't fabulous. They definitely
Mhm.
are. But yeah, if we could incorporate a little bit more play, sometimes it's sort of like, what could this, kind of like morph into?
Absolutely. And I will say, like, some of my favorite studios that shouldn't say favorite, some of the studios I've enjoyed working with the most have had an element of that in there, where there's this
Hmm.
exploratory time, not just for, exploring design, but really everything, kind of in context to one another. Like, and then I've worked with other places that are very regimented. Like, no, we need to sort out the
Right.
storyboard for this, the traditional workflow. But it seems like when that's built in, which again is much, I shouldn't say much easier because that's not true a lot of the time, but at least some of the experiences that I've had so far in TV and film, there's been a little bit more of this kind of play and exploration involved for a period of time before
That's really
diving into
cool.
that.
Hmm.
Which to your point, it's super liberating. Like as an artist who's used to just like next project, okay, bust it out,
Right.
follow the formula, next project, follow the formula. It gets a little monotonous. So having some of that
Right.
breakup's pretty awesome.
Nice. Were there, because this was a personal piece, did you give yourself and your team like some constraint to work within? Or were you just kind of like, let's just have at it, explore, kind of just constantly explore with this whole piece?
You know, this one, no. I am a huge proponent of putting constraints on, because really like a certain level of constraint makes you more creative, right? At the end of the day, that's
Hmm.
100% true. If you have something to keep you, I always think about them like bumpers on a bowling lane. If you have some bumpers that keep you going in the same direction, it's a lot easier to come to something that's cohesive and a little bit
Hmm.
maybe more meaningful. So I do think this one was a weird one just because of timing. I was also kind of had this, I still do actually. I'm transitioning to focus on a startup called Simplate. Um, and this was around the time that was kind of getting off the ground and starting. So I didn't have as many constraints with the people that I was working with because I was juggling so many different things. But also, I do think that
Right.
that was one of the reasons why it was floating around for so long, because there wasn't clear direction. Um,
Gotcha.
but again, there didn't really have to be, so I didn't worry about it a whole lot, But
Right.
typically,
Right.
I do like having some sort of constraints on them. Especially designing just by myself, like on the early, when I first sat down after those shoots and I tried my initial test pieces, it was just spinning my wheels. Like there was nothing
Right.
happening. So I had to put some constraints on myself, like, okay, this type of texture, this kind of like papered texture, of course, with an unabridged dictionary, that makes a ton of sense. How does that work? There was like these really minuscule pieces of like, okay, it needs to be in that realm. But other than that,
Hmm.
not really.
And you had mentioned too that, like one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but that the goal of putting this together was so that you could get the opportunity or at least have a piece in the portfolio about title sequences so that you would, get the opportunity to work on some in the
Yeah.
future. Um, were there any specific technical goals that you had to sort of achieve that, like sort of bigger goal? Or were you just, again, sort of like,
Mhm.
I'll use whatever I need to just get this job done?
No, it never felt like that. Really, the biggest technical limitation was at this time. Again, I was really, when this started, I was much more into the illustrative, cinematic chromosphere stuff. So from the technical side, like that one film supply music bed piece was more of where this piece ended up, where I had like footage and I was able to composite that together and integrate that footage and those, compositions within a single design. So the one thing that I
Hmm.
knew I wanted to get from this was improving my 3D chops. So if there was
Okay.
anything that I had like on as a restriction or like something that I really wanted to gain from this was pushing my ability, especially with the third-party render engines, like Redshift. I just
Right.
wanted to get more comfortable in there because I knew
Sure.
that's a skill that I need to be able to show. That's something that I need to be comfortable with and getting into this world. And I just didn't have as much of that. So that was really the only thing that I really focused on from a technical perspective.
Nice. Yeah. Well, and you keep alluding to the sort of this chromosphere illustrative
Hmm.
style too. I feel like when I first discovered your work, that's what I sort of put to your name too in
Right.
your, social
Right.
profile, because it was very illustrative. And then, but cinematic at the same time. Like there's always been this sort of like stylized cinematic aura about your work. And yeah, now you can sort of see that you have made a shift into like more of the sort of stylized photorealistic type of stuff
Right.
now too. So was there any inspiration behind, going in this sort of creative direction for this piece?
I mean, of course, the big ones, like Westworld is still just absolutely like there's all these Elastic and Patrick Clare pieces and that I just absolutely still love to this day. But I'd have to look back at my original inspiration boards to really remember because it morphed so much over time that it ended up just being this thing that was on its own, for better or for worse. I don't know if it really made it better.
Right.
Um, but not really in this piece. The big thing with illustration that I had gotten away from, which by the way, the thing that you're thinking of what is my name is just a ton of layers. It's just like the most subtle layer, put it in there. Subtle layer, like I'll have 200 just layers that really ultimately you could do in maybe four. And that's the stuff I really love, depth and like faux lens effects, anything to make it cinematic, even, and that's what I was drawn to with the illustration stuff, was that juxtaposition between what you consider traditional like illustration, which I cannot draw. I have not put attempts into drawing and learning to draw, so I'd have to do workarounds with vector work and then shading and Photoshop and stuff. But I always liked that juxtaposition. This one was like, okay, well, why don't I just try to take that same approach that I love so much about layers and just subtlety and cohesion and do that more in the 3D realm?
Hmm.
And that was really more the driver than like any one particular piece. Because again, I didn't have the
Gotcha.
skills and the abilities to be able to meet that. So it's just kind of like
You
That's
keep saying
torture.
that, but I just don't believe it whatsoever
I,
because this came out beautifully.
well, I appreciate that. I appreciate that. But when you hold yourself to a higher standard, it's like put that
True.
next to some of the all-time greats, and we'll see.
I was gonna say, I mean, you're mentioning like Patrick
Yeah,
Clare and Elastic,
yeah,
and so it's sort of like, yeah, you're setting an expectation and a bar. But
right.
I mean, this piece when it came out was beautiful, still is
Thank you.
beautiful.
I
And
really
again, the whole
appreciate
case study that you put
that.
behind it, I'm a huge fan of your case studies because you just go into so much depth and detail about what it took to get here. What was inspiration, and what were the technical challenges. So when you had said, let's commit to doing this unabridged frame, I was just sort of like, this is going to be a lot of fun to talk
Good.
about because of the case study that you
Right.
put with it. When it came out and you shared it on social media,
Yeah.
beautiful.
That's
And
so
then when you
great to
read
hear.
about it, it's like, oh, this is so cool.
Yeah.
Like how you got from initial idea to this final product.
Well, I do want to do a quick shout out to case studies. If anybody's listening thinks that it's not worth your time, I can't tell you. I know 100% for sure, like my career, the trajectory that it's taken would not have happened if I didn't put time into that. And I think there's so many upsides. Again, just
Mm-hmm.
as a side note, like taking time to really think through your thought process and present that to people in a way not only helps present you and the way you work to other, potential employers, producers, creative directors, whatever, but it also helps solidify in your mind your own process and what you've gone through. It really helps you kind of churn back over what you've done, what you could have done differently when you just have to face it and like write it in a cohesive way. I think
For sure.
there's so many upsides to doing this on so many different levels that I really, whenever I talk to younger artists, like for a college program or something, or even high school program, like do write-ups. I'm telling you, it might seem like a
Right.
waste of time, but there's so much to come from it. Like so many
No,
positive
they're
things.
so invaluable.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could be wrong about where I saw this from, but I believe Ryan Summers had said it in his level up course with School of Motion that like, if you want to get to these levels of like art and creative direction and even executive production,
Right.
writing is like such a tool that, you should practice a lot.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely.
so do you feel based on your projects, have you felt that putting together all these case studies has helped you with, getting to some of the positions you've worked on recently? Like you were a creative director on that, was it iCarly
Yeah,
sequence?
yeah.
Yeah.
That was a fun one. Um, it like came around last minute, but I was the quote unquote animation director of like 3 people, so it wasn't anything crazy. but um, but I mean, you can pretty much take anything that Ryan says as gospel. Like that dude is just man, he's so knowledgeable. He's so open with his time too. He's a gem for our industry. Um,
Yep.
but I couldn't agree more. Just like everything we were saying, it's equally as important for your artistic self as it is for your career oriented, your professional self that we want to try to grow and get into, bigger opportunities, bigger positions. I've yet to really been able to um, crack that area, which ultimately I haven't been at this strictly freelance world for all that long in the context of things like these other people, like a lot of other people in the industry. But I'm thinking that that could definitely lead to it if I was more focused, on just freelance work right now. That's
Mm-hmm.
one of the big struggles that I've been having personally, is trying to juggle starting a business and focus on freelance, and still like this is my passion. I am so passionate about what we do. I love what we do. This is what I want to spend my time doing. It's just that becomes the other big struggle, I think, for an artist, even if you're not starting up a company and you're just freelancing, is trying to keep this artistic, free thinking, flowing brain. It's, again, in direct contrast to that more analytical side that's necessary for the career or keeping track of
Mm-hmm.
everything for your freelance. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm getting off topic, so
No, it's
I
fine.
do that.
It's totally
Yeah.
fine. Well, I had one last question for
Yeah.
you. What would you say the biggest challenge and or reward was by working on this piece?
Um, I mean, for sure, the biggest challenge was just crossing the finish line with something I was comfortable with sharing, because it had just been going on for so long, and it had failed so many times, you know, like I told you there was those two big pivots, but there was so many nights and weekends in between that of just like, this frame isn't there. This frame isn't there. And then you get
Mm-hmm.
this big, you know, kind of gush of inspiration, and then you make some big progress and another step back. So I think for sure the biggest challenge was just like sticking with it. Cause, you know, I've still got this personal project, which that's another thing, just for a heads up on the people who have yet to discover the power of personal projects, is you don't necessarily have to finish them to gain or reap the rewards and benefits of it. But
Mm-hmm.
I had a big personal project that I literally have 2 shots still to this day left to finish on that I never completed. So
Wow.
I very easily could have had this one go in that bin of like, you know, I learned a lot. I'll do a case study on it. I'll present it, but I'm not going to have a final piece to show.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me was the biggest challenge of just like getting it across the finish line, saying, all right, like it's not as profound as I thought it could have been, but I'm pretty damn happy
Gotcha.
with it, you know. Like,
And what was the biggest reward by working on this?
crossing the finish line.
Really?
No, I mean, from a professional sense, like again, it got me, it opened doors for me with clients, and it got me in the door with some pretty amazing clients. So I think like from a true reward, like endorphins firing in my brain, for sure, that's it, you know.
Sure.
And that was the goal, right? Because again, this wasn't my first uh, title sequence that I had done, a personal project. There's actually one more to come after this, but this was the one that somehow made its way to these producers and creative directors. So I think that's for sure, probably in the long run, like, oh my God, my plan worked. It actually
Yeah.
worked. You know?
I was gonna say, well,
Well,
we've seen some of your stuff on Netflix with, you know, Elastic and everything.
yeah,
So I was gonna say it definitely, you know, it worked.
yeah, it worked. It worked. 100%. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, it's been, you know, unless you have anything else you'd like to add or share, you know, it's been awesome talking with you about this project. I'm so glad that you chose this frame and this project to specifically talk about, you know, learning a bit about your background in motion design and animation and video. And again, working through this project and this favorite frame that you chose. If people want to connect with you, learn more about what you're working on, what's the best way for them to do so?
So feel free to, of course, head over to my website and check stuff out. But my email is jbergren, Bergren, at jordanbruce.tv, and you can contact me there. We'll see how much longer I'm really active. A whole lot on that side. I'm not sure I'll ever really get rid of it. But I am, you know, like I said, transitioning into this position with startup. So if that doesn't work, feel free to get at me at jordan.bergren at simplate.io. I always love talking to people. Like, honestly, it's my favorite thing when someone reaches out and just wants to like hop on and talk shop, because it's a nice little break from things to be able to meet and network with people, especially in these days where like NAB's been canceled the last however many years now, right?
Yeah.
So I am an open book, and I'm always wanting to help people who are really excited about this industry. So
That's
that's the
awesome.
best way.
And if you're active on social, you know, where can people find you nowadays on social as well?
Social, I'm gonna like hang my head low because I don't do a whole lot on social. Find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Twitter handle JB Bruce. I'm trying to be more active there. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm in all the normal spots. I don't do TikTok or anything like that.
No TikTok dances for you? Come on.
No, not me. I can't dance. You know, it's just something I haven't acquired. But find me anywhere. Like, honestly, I would love to chat with anybody. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again, Jordan. It's been such a pleasure. You know, we'll share some links to some of the stuff that we've talked about today, including some of the studios and resources, even, you know, the company stuff that you had mentioned as well, for everyone, our audience, to check out. But yeah, that about wraps it up for today. Guys, feel free to email us at styleframesatpod@gmail.com. We'll drop a little description at the bottom for you. So you can get that without just hearing it. You can visually see it. You know, we'd love to hear what you think of the show. If you have any questions, comments, suggestions, also come connect with us on social. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you guys. Thank you, Jordan,
Thank you.
for tuning in, and we'll see you all in the next one.